Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee for securing this very important debate, and along with other colleagues, I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Kensington, for her powerful speech and for all the work she's been doing to support her community and particularly the victims of the Grenfell fire. I want to start also by commemorating the 72 people who lost their lives, who needlessly lost their lives, and all those who've been injured and traumatised by what has happened in that terrible fire. The grieving and suffering, the trauma and anguish have not diminished since that dreadful night, and our thoughts remain with those who are affected, who are having to live the nightmare again and again, worsened by the fact that the government yet again still has failed to tackle the underlying problems that leave people at risk despite what has happened. Like Hillsborough, the Grenfell Tower fire was an avoidable man-made disaster, a story of warnings ignored and official neglect, the stuff of nightmares that could have been prevented. Shockingly, it has emerged that since the disaster, the ACM cladding and similar flammable cladding, as others have already mentioned, are present in hundreds of buildings across the country. In my own constituency, many blocks have ACM cladding. In the immediate aftermath, ministers promised swift action to replace the ACM cladding. But as we've already heard, that action hasn't seen the urgency that is desperately required. And members across the House, as well as the campaign groups such as Grenfell United and many others, have had to fight tooth and nail to secure £400 million for social housing blocks to have ACM cladding. And more recently, after much campaigning, once again with the support of Inside Housing as well as others and members here in this House, especially on this side of the House, the government finally grudgingly agreed to provide £200 million to remove dangerous ACM cladding in private blocks. I'm grateful to the government, I'm grateful to ministers for doing so, but people shouldn't have had to wait a year first for the social housing funding and another 2 years for the private housing blocks, and it is still not enough because 1,700 high-rise blocks in the UK have non-ACM cladding that is also dangerous, and the government needs to act. We shouldn't have to keep coming back begging ministers to address this appalling failure. The ministers should be using their own initiative. If the risk of further fatalities and death is not scary enough for them, then what is? I mean, how can ministers live with themselves if this fatality is repeated in the future? I know that ministers don't wish to see further fatalities, so we need the government, cross-government working to ensure that the resources are available and the legislation is provided to back up the urgent work that's required for all buildings that are at risk. After Grenfell, the government banned, as my honourable friend has said, the use of combustible cladding on some high-rise buildings over 18 metres in the UK. But that doesn't go far enough, because people will remain unsafe in cladded buildings which are under 18 metres. And the ban that is limited to hospitals, student accommodation and care homes is not enough. It needs to be comprehensive for any block that has ACM cladding or dangerous, other forms of dangerous material that needs to be removed. Dangerous cladding is a risk on all buildings, irrespective of their height or purpose. A fire doesn't discriminate between buildings of different use, between student accommodation or an office block, between a private owner or a social housing tenant. That is why a comprehensive, urgent solution is required. And for the government to continue to permit combustible materials of any kind, on our buildings is not acceptable for the reasons that ministers have already heard about. It is a dereliction of duty to carry on like this, and that's why it's vital that ministers take this seriously and act without constantly having to face pressure before they take action. And as others have said, the Prime Minister said, my government will do whatever it takes to keep our people safe. It has done nothing of the sort. It has taken some action, but frankly, it is not acceptable. And if the minister's raising an eyebrow, he should try living in one of those blocks, perhaps for a few nights, and see what it feels like, the fear, the insecurity, and the anguish families have to live through with their children in the fear that their homes might burn down in the event that a further fatality happens. That is why this is so important. That is why action is needed. The regulatory system has failed to protect our residents. Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2016, I raised in the House concerns about the inability of residents to be able to complain to the local government ombudsman of major disrepair issues which could lead to further fatalities. Grenfell tenants raised some of those issues, complained about problems they were facing and risks before the fire, long before the fire, well documented in programs like the Panorama documentary. One of the major issues for residents is that they have to, under the Localism Act, they have to wait a few weeks before and then contact a Member of Parliament to submit their complaints to the Ombudsman. Those things delay attention to major issues, particularly around safety in the blocks people live in. And the government could improve the regulation to ensure residents have a strong voice. They could ensure that there is better accountability and transparency about the kind of blocks people are living in, the kind of safety issues that those blocks face, so that people can hold the management of those buildings, whether they're freeholders or RSLs or ALMOs, arm's length bodies, to account. We must never allow a further fatality like Grenfell to happen again, and that is why the government must act quickly.